Hello and welcome back, and that is right, this is another frequently asked questions section on PS5 upgrades. A number of you are coming completely new into the subject of NVMe M.2 storage on this new console, and unlike traditional hard drives that you plug in with USB, it's actually a great deal more complex than you would think. There are no stupid or no wrong questions here, and it's understandable that a number of you arriving at this point are suddenly kind of, ooh, don't really understand this. So again, much like my previous video last month where we went through the most frequently asked questions that you guys have put in the comments on this subject, we're going to tackle a bunch more today, and we might do a video like this every month until we've covered the entire gamut of your questions. But let's crack on straight away with question number 1. This is actually a very legitimate question because a number of you, when you're looking at the specifications of different SSD upgrades for your PS5, have noticed that in some cases, when you go to larger capacities, the performance gets higher, but that's not always the case. And sometimes the larger capacities either have static performance against the predecessor or actually are worse. So what is the logic? How do we know when an SSD is going to increase performance and capacity in the same way? Now, a lot of the reason for the differences in performance, not only between different SSDs, but different capacities, is down to NAND distribution. This is the chips that live on the board of an SSD. Now, what you're looking for are the big uniform ones. These are known as the NAND. This is where the data lives on these SSDs. Now, what we have here is two 1 TB SSDs. They look quite similar, has to be said, although obviously one chip is very different. That's the controller there. But these are both 1 TB SSDs. But the one in this hand has significantly higher performance, a little bit more in read, but particularly in write. Now, the reason this SSD has a higher performance than this SSD is because this SSD is double-sided. This SSD has NAND chips on either side, whereas this SSD has nothing on the back and two chips on the front. They're both 1 TB, but this one's a higher performer. The reason is that the storage has been spread much more over this SSD than this one. In the case of this SSD, we have two 512 gigabyte NAND chips for this 1 TB drive. So that's two NAND chips. This one has 4 chips on it of 256 gigabyte. They both add up to the usual 1024, but this one is distributed over more chips. That allows a greater degree of read and write activity simultaneously, much like the drives inside a NAS, something else I talk about on the channel. The result is that the larger number of NAND chips on the SSD, the greater amount of that activity that can happen simultaneously, and therefore you get the larger performance. Now, once you reach 2 TB in most storage areas, you can't really exceed the amount of storage space on here. At 2 TB and at a length like this, known as 2280 length in SSD, you can't really increase the number of NAND chips. Once you go from 2 TB to 4 TB, that's why you find the performance either stays exactly the same, or in some cases it can actually dip, as at that point the NAND becomes a greater deal more dense. And that is why there is a difference in performance across these SSDs. So yes, you can get increased performance if you go up in capacity, but where you get the increased performance is when you go for double-sided SSDs rather than single-sided SSDs. Another surprisingly frequently asked question about changing the heatsink on SSDs. Now, a number of you will buy an SSD that has a proprietary heatsink pre-installed, like this one. This is the Adlink A95. It has a heatsink on board. Now, in most cases, the heatsink that an SSD arrives with should be more than sufficient for the PS5. But in some cases, whether you want to upgrade maybe to that Sabrent PS5 heatsink there, or you notice that the heatsink your SSD arrived with is a little low rent and you want to go for something a little bit more aggressive, some of you want to change that SSD. And depending on the architecture, it won't damage the SSD to change the heatsink, and more importantly, if you do swap onto the other heatsink, it can actually be more beneficial. But it's worth bearing in mind that not all heatsinks are equal. In most cases, a heatsink will arrive with this. This is thermal This is known as a thermal pad. Now, thermal pads come in different versions. Some of them are a lot more rigid and foamy than others. This one is more of a kind of Play-Doh kind of thing. It tears apart, but it won't tear apart as you remove from the SSD. It won't damage the chips. It does not have the adhesive nature to do any damage to the SSD. It's not going to pull the chips. They're incredibly well soldered on there. Again, as long as you leverage it off slowly, you should be absolutely fine. The ones you have to look out for are SSDs that use a very strong adhesive on their heatsink. This again is that AdLink SSD that we've talked about, and this one used an incredibly sticky and adhesive thermal silicon gel when this was applied. It increases thermal conductivity and therefore makes the heatsink work ever better. But in this case, do check out on the specification sheet of any SSD, because they will detail how it is attached. And in the case of, say, this one, when we did remove it, the result was that you can see there the fragmented paste all the way along there and fragments of the paste on the SSD. It didn't damage the SSD, but it was an incredibly delicate job removing it from there. And in the case of SSDs like this that use a silicon paste or take advantage of a kind of silicon gel, these are ones where I would not recommend removing that heatsink, because although you might not damage the SSD per se, it will render the heatsink almost useless as it completely loses any adhesivity to the SSD. And also when removing it, you do run the damage of bending the PCB. So not harming the chips, but you can bend the PCB that the SSD utilizes inside. In some cases, like the WD Black heatsink here, this one, although it is lightly adhesively attached, it's actually metal clipped onto the SSD, and in that case, once again, you will damage the heatsink when removing it. So before you even attempt removing the heatsink, do double check what kind of thermal connection it is utilizing. A thermal pad, you're absolutely fine. Thermal gel, absolutely fine. But anything to do with silicon or adhesive connectivity there, it is better to err on the side of caution and not remove it. Unsurprisingly, the answer is almost always an unresounding yes. PS4 games that are played from the internal PS5 SSD will perform better in terms of loading. However, they won't perform massively different compared with if they were running on an external drive. Now, if you were comparing the loading of a game on, say, a PS4 or PS4 Pro that was running a traditional hard drive, then you will see an enormous difference when moving over to an M.2 NVMe installed inside the PS5. But if you were already running from an SSD system, the difference is going to be quite small. You will notice more difference, it has to be said, at initial loading than you will see in overall world loading. When we did do tests previously across a large number of SSDs that we've tested over the last few weeks and months, it has to be said that the PS4 games we tested, the only ones that we saw substantial differences in are incredibly large and ever-evolving games like Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto, because those are games that have had huge numbers of graphical and service updates in their lifetime, which have scaled alongside developments in technology. Games that have come out probably more than 2 to 3 years ago, you won't see a huge difference from those, because those games are kind of already limited to how much they can be built during loading. So yes, you will see an improvement in performance of PS4 games if you install them on the SSD M.2 slot on the PS5, but you'll only see notable improvements in more modern games that are able to take advantage of that throughput. Coming hot off the back of that PS4 question, it has to be said that a number of you are looking at upgrades for the PS5 where you're not looking to break the bank. You don't plan on running PS5 games from that M.2 slot. You just want to fully populate with your PS4 collection. Also, you're only really interested in capacity more than performance. Ergo, you're not looking at some highfalutin, high-price SSD that can pop out 7,000 megs and read and 6,800 megs. Right, you want an affordable SSD. You want one that is going to work, but it doesn't need to go crazy. So, what is the lowest performing and lowest price SSD that actually works on the PS5, and it's an ADATA Gamix S50 Lite. It's one of their lowest of the lowest tier PCIe Gen 4 SSDs. Ironically, it is actually not the lowest quality one, because out there we have, of course, seen QLC SSDs that we talked about for quad layer SAIL NAND, but even those outperform this very early gen PCIe Gen 4 SSD. Now, not to be confused with the ADATA XPG Gamix S70, the S50 Lite is a far more affordable SSD, arriving at about £94 per terabyte. That's the lowest price I saw out there. Once you compare that against the WD Black, which is around 60 to 70% more expensive than that, that gives you some idea on the terabyte level just how low in price this is for a terabyte of storage on NVMe PCIe Gen 4 SSD. What are the performance figures? Well, at its lowest capacity of 512 gigabytes, it puts out 3,800 megabytes per second sequential read and 2,800 megabytes per second sequential write. That is almost a third in write than that XPG here at their top end, and more than half of that of the sequential read. So much lower. And Digital Foundry did some testing on this SSD. I'm hoping to do my own test shortly. And although, yes, it was slower, loading pretty much all the games they tested, it wasn't end of the world slower. It added, I think, at best 1 second to loading times, and at worst 6 or 7 seconds loading time. And if you, don't mind, maybe you want to stir the tea a couple more times, get a couple more crisps in the mouth, you might enjoy having that there. So again, that is the lowest and slowest SSD, the ADATA XPG Gamix S50 Lite. And of course, talking about lowest and slowest, we can actually start talking about the PS5 internal SSD. To date, no one has actually made a fully accurate benchmark of the performance of the internal PS5 SSD. One of the biggest problems there is that, one, there is no actual benchmark internally that can be spat out of you that says what the internal benchmark is. If you install an SSD inside this, the first thing it does when it boots up is it says to you, this is what the PS5 benchmarks this SSD at, and it gives a benchmark based on its own internal values that are actually different to the likes of your Attos and your AJ8s and your Crystal Disk. But there's absolutely no internal measurement provided for internal write speed there. And this is one of the biggest tells here, because when we're transferring data to and from in all of our tests, when we were moving games from the internal PS5 SSD over to the M.2 SSD that we installed, when moving the games back, we noticed that moving games from the M.2 slot back onto the SSD inside the PS5 was around 5 to 6 times slower, which was really surprising. And we know there is an element of compression that we will talk about in a moment in another question, but still nonetheless, it was really surprising to see that the internal SSD had such a low write speed. Now, it makes a lot of sense given that the PS5 currently doesn't really take advantage of write speed so much, but based on all of the games that we tested and results taken from other websites online that have performed similar tests, they have rated that the internal write performance of the PS5 SSD sits somewhere between 1100 megabytes per second and 1800 megabytes per second. Now, I'm aware that is a huge disparity. However, that's because most of the tests that were conducted were very block dependent. Some games have a lot more sequential data than others. Some games, much smaller, have many small files, and some of them use enormous bolted together asset data all the way between. So therefore it makes it incredibly difficult to benchmark that performance with such huge variables and differences in terms of block sizes, or not so much block sizes I should say, but the actual pieces of data moved back and forth in between them. Now, of course, write speed, they've been a little bit more transparent about, somewhere sitting at 5,500 megabytes per second sequential there. That's why the minimum recommendation from Sony for upgrades is 5,500, but still, that write performance is definitely lower than 1800 there, but where it sits between them, we still don't know. We can't even just remove the PS5 SSD from the system and interface it with another system. It doesn't have a classical M.2 interface inside. It's directly interfaced with the board inside, so we can't just pop it out and stick it in something else there. But there you go. That is the best answer we have right now with regards to that internal PS5 SSD write speed. This has been a surprisingly common question. Can you just have this SSD inside the PS5, fill it with games, remove it from the PS5 and stick it in another PS5 and play those games? The simple answer is no, you definitely can't. I've tried it on numerous occasions when we were doing some of our early testing of games, and although there's absolutely no paper trail or note doc that we can follow there, just simple testing has shown that once we had this SSD, filled it with games, moved it over to another PlayStation 5 that had the same PSN account, it still wouldn't recognise it. There must be some form of hard-coded link with the system itself, not just the PSN, as you would expect, where if you move it over, you need to use the same PlayStation user account, of course, but something was hardwired or at least hard encoded with checks in the background where these games would only run on this particular PS5 once we moved those games out. Now, why you would do this, I'm not entirely certain. I can understand that you would want to archive games, stick a bunch of games onto an M.2, maybe an external SSD, and then keep it on a shelf in case PSN removes a game like they did, of course, with PT, but I can't, the benefits of moving it over to another PS5, I'm not sure, other than saving internet bandwidth, but still nonetheless, there's the answer to your question. You can't just fill it with games, hand it to someone else, and they can play your games. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. This has been actually quite a common thing in the comments when people are talking about SSDs. Right now, they are kind of researching what is the drive they're going to buy on Black Friday. Every year here on the channel, I have talked a lot about Black Friday, kind of give people a heads up about the best thing to go for and what to watch out for. And then on the event itself, I will tend to look around different websites and find the best deals and then post them here or in an article linked in the description. However, of course, Black Friday at the time of recording this is more than a month away. So what are the SSDs that you should keep an eye out for? Well, not only based on the SSDs in the market right now, but also based on the trends from brands themselves, I would definitely say one of these four. I would say Sabrent tend to be on Black Friday deals annually, and I would say right now, with the huge demand there is for their product in terms of PS5 stuff, I would definitely say they'd be on there. Another big player every single year is WD, of course. Lots of you last year picked up the Samsung 980 Pro and the WD Black SN850 during that Black Friday event. Indeed, the predecessor, the SN750, was massively on sale during that time. So again, do look out for those two. Now, when it comes to Seagate, whether we see the FireCuda 530 on any kind of sale is debatable, because the FireCuda 530 is probably the newest SSD here on the table, and moreover, it is an SSD that already commands quite a high price tag and is ultimately, as soon as it's available, it sells out immediately. Consequently, although it might be in the Black Friday sales, I wouldn't guarantee it. However, its predecessor, the FireCuda 520, which does work in the PS5, this one I reckon you will see on some sales. It's the previous generation. They're obviously going to be shifting focus towards the 530 in a big way, and ergo, I would not be surprised if you see this one on sale. But once again, I will be making a dedicated video and some articles on Black Friday SSDs for the PS5, so I strongly recommend you subscribe or link to the article in the description and subscribe to the blog, because I will be posting deals as I find them on there to help you guys get the right SSD for your PS5 on the day. Finally, should you opt for an SSD that utilises a Phison controller or an Innogrit? For those that aren't aware, right now in terms of PCIe Gen 4 connectivity, there are a lot of controllers on the market, but the ones that have bubbled all the way to the top are the latest Phison E18 controller and the Innogrit Rainer IG5236. 5236. These two controllers are kind of the most cutting edge PCIe Gen 4 SSD controllers in the market, giving the best performance, a great durability, and overall improved IOPS overall. Of course, there are first-party controllers from the likes of Samsung and WD. These are all in-house controllers that utilise their own R&D and their own NAND developed on site. And although the performance is very, very good in terms of sequential read and indeed IOPS, sequential write seems to be lower on these than it is on these. So if you are choosing between these two, which should you opt for? Well, unsurprisingly, I am going to say that the E18 controller is probably on balance the best overall. We've seen a lot of E18 controller SSDs have IOPS in the 1 million overall. We've also seen them utilise a greater degree of IOPS on balance at the top end, not just in that sequential performance, but with the IOPS combined with it, and with all of our testing, AJ8 and Crystal Disk and more, they have generally been the better performing of the bunch. However, Innogrit SSDs, because the SSD doesn't have the acclaim that the Phison does, the Innogrit Rainer is their first PCIe Gen 4 controller. The result is that this brand's, the SSDs that utilise the Innogrit, such as the XPG, Gamix and the Blade, as well as the Viper Patriot VP4300, these are lower in price at every terabyte level. Indeed, I have yet to see an Innogrit SSD that doesn't have an inclusive heatsink and still arrive lower in price than a bare bones Phison E18 SSD. You get better value for money there, and with write and read performance still in the high 6000s and mid-range 7000 for write and read respectively, durability living between 0.4 and 0.5, and still IOPS figures in 800,000 to close to 1 million, it's still a great controller SSD there. So if you are looking at the best overall, when it comes to, if you count up all the points at the end, it's going to be the Phison. But if you want the best value for money and still getting a great SSD, the Innogrit controller SSDs are still pretty good. But this has been our second round of frequently asked questions for the PS5 SSD storage area. Again, I'm going to try to do one of these a month as more and more questions go into the comments. If you do have any questions that I've missed, bung them in the comments below, or I do strongly recommend you watch the previous video as we covered 10 questions there in varying detail about the storage upgrade for this system. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed it, click like. It helps me understand what videos do the best and helps me make better videos for you guys next time. Click subscribe and the bell to be notified about more videos on this subject and to do with anything to do with storage in general. And of course, as mentioned earlier in the video, next month during Black Friday, I'm going to try to cover as many SSDs as possible that are featured as deals. We'll do a couple of dedicated ones where we're going to talk about the best deals. So again, we're going to try to do that, if not on the day of Black Friday, then maybe the day before if one's crop up. So do subscribe for those if you are still waiting for that event to buy your SSD, as hopefully I'll help you guys find a bargain, but we'll see. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.